Before I begin, I'd like to warn you that this presentation contains offensive language and terminology taken from official U.S. government documents. In the 1950s, the United States was emerging from a period of hardship. The entire country had been mobilized during World War II, fighting in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Before that, the Great Depression had shaken faith in the government in its ability to perform. This set the stage for a revival of America's Protestant Christian culture. In the words of historian Kevin Cruz, according to the conventional narrative, the Soviet Union discovered the bomb and the United States rediscovered God. Today, I'll be examining the relationship between the anti-LGBTQ purges of the early Cold War, McCarthyism, and the rise of the evangelical right. The Soviet Union, as guided by the writing of Karl Marx, was subject to state-sponsored atheism. This contrasted sharply with the majority belief of the United States as a predominantly Protestant nation. This divide in religion would prove to be a catalyst for propaganda, and in 1953, after being appointed as Dwight D. Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles would take an aggressive stance against communism. He stated that the United States should oppose the Soviets primarily because they were atheists, referring to the political system as godless terrorism. A major component of evangelicalism in the 1950s is Billy Graham, whose national tours and sermons from 1949 to 1954 reached 12 million people and established him as a household name. A combination of new forms of media, backed by a growing consumer economy in the United States, fanned the flame and allowed Graham to reach a wider audience than ever possible before, drawing heavily on Protestant tradition, fundamentalism, and a literal interpretation of the Bible. Furthermore, the transition of religious beliefs from the personal sphere to the public sphere began to occur, a sharp break from its fundamentalist roots. Graham's teaching of the 1950s focused on two of the most present themes in the Cold War threats, one being that of communism and the other being nuclear war. Graham perpetrated the ideas Dulles put forth, delivering them to a large audience as one of the United States' first televangelists. He is quoted as stating, "Western culture and its fruits had foundation in the Bible, the Word of God, and in the revivals of the 17th and 18th centuries. Communism, on the other hand, has decided against God, against Christ, against the Bible, and against all religion." His sermons encouraged Americans to be watchful against communist infiltration of the United States, encouraging responsible Christianity. Graham defined communism as religion of the devil, and in doing so helped establish an us versus them mentality of the American Christian against the atheist Soviet Union. In 1954, the phrase, "one nation under God," was officially added to the American Pledge of Allegiance, and was in part an effort by the Knights of Columbus. On February 4th, 1954, Michigan Republican Representative Charles Oakman introduced a bill to the House floor regarding the change. The bill passed and was signed into law by Eisenhower, who stated, "From this day forward, the millions of our school children will daily proclaim the dedication of our nation and our people to the Almighty. In this way, we are reaffirming the transcendence of religious faith in America's heritage and future. In this way, we shall constantly strengthen those spiritual weapons which forever will be our country's most powerful resource in peace or in war." Until McCarthyism began to have major influence regarding large sweeping reforms of American policy towards the gay community, the community itself didn't exist in the modern sense. Despite this, metropolitan areas such as Washington, D.C. could be considered accepting, if not welcoming, to people who identified outside of sexual conventions, according to David K. Johnson, author of the book, The Lavender Scare, The Cold War Persecution of Gays and Lesbians in the Federal Government. Roosevelt's New Deal agencies brought a large number of young men and women to Washington, creating a large urban area of young workers. Following the Second World War, public attention began to turn towards the two groups as perceived by many Americans as being the biggest threats to American values and culture, homosexuals and communists. Johnson states, "Both groups were perceived as hidden subcultures with their own meeting places, literature, cultural codes, and bonds of loyalty. Both groups were thought to recruit to their ranks the psychologically weak or disturbed, and both groups were considered immoral and godless. Many people believed that the two groups were working together to undermine the government. Several tabloid newspapers of the 1950s stated that the country was in a moral decline. They perceived the effects of the gay community. The belief persisted that the communists were promoting sexual perversion in the United States in an effort to use homosexuals as a fifth column to make the United States more susceptible through the use of effeminate men. Senator Kenneth Weary vocalized these ideas in a 1950 interview with Max Lerner, stating that one could hardly separate homosexuals from subversives. During this interview, he also suggested that Adolf Hitler during World War II had delivered Joseph Stalin a list of closeted homosexuals who could be blackmailed into becoming Soviet spies. These beliefs were the result of fear-mongering from the conservative political class in an effort to turn the public against gay and lesbian people deemed a threat, and would result in decades of mistreatment and abuse for members of the LGBTQ community. Although the Red Scare is widely known as a result of McCarthyism and the numerous congressional investigations of the early Cold War, its equally devastating counterpart, the Lavender Scare, did not catch the public attention in the same way. The term Lavender Scare derived from the phrase lavender lad, which was a common derogatory way in which many congressmen and other government officials would refer to gay men. In 1950, the Committee on Expenditures and Executives Departments received a report from its subcommittee led by Chairman Clyde R. Hoey of North Carolina entitled Employment of Homosexuals and Other Sex Perverts in the Government. This document would be the foundation of a program which would remove over 5,000 homosexual people from the federal government, ranging from state workers to military personnel. The investigation would not only cost individuals their jobs, but they would be forcibly outed to the public. Bruce Forbes had spent almost 10 years as a U.S. Foreign Service officer before being appointed to vice consul at the American Embassy in Paris. Forbes was a devoted public servant who spoke multiple languages. However, Eisenhower's executive order authorized government agencies to examine the personal lives of their employees. According to the Lavender Scare, the documentary based on Johnson's book in the spring of 1953, Forbes arrived at work to find 3 government agents waiting for him who confronted him about living with a known homosexual. This was true as Forbes had been sharing an apartment with another man in Paris, but denied any sexual involvement with the man. Forbes resigned, although it was now public knowledge as to why he had left his government position. The fear of being outed was highly prevalent, as many of those investigated during the Lavender Scare who refused to cooperate were threatened with deeper examinations of their personal lives, which very likely would have exposed them to friends and family. I submitted my resignation immediately. They didn't have any evidence that I was gay, but if they had continued to investigate, they would have found it, Forbes stated. The document presented by the Subcommittee on Investigation directly made note of the illegality of homosexual relationships at the time under the United States' sodomy laws. They utilized medical and psychological experts in order to identify stereotypes of homosexual men, suggesting that some have female characteristics and are easy to identify, while others are masculine and more difficult to identify. This document often refers to the individuals as perverts. Hoey's subcommittee would also suggest that not only was homosexuality a mental illness, that there was a cure for it. In the subsection, General Unsuitability of Sex Perverts, the committee outlines the belief that homosexual people did not meet acceptable standards for government employees due to the fact that their actions were illegal, and anyone involved with such actions would work diligently to cover up any wrongdoings. The committee also raised concerns that gay individuals working in government agencies would seek sexual relations with coworkers, citing the lack of mental stability. According to Hoey's committee, homosexuality weakens the moral fiber of an individual to a degree that he is not suitable for a position of responsibility. The document alleges that the mere presence of a gay person can have a corrosive influence on a government office, stating that it is particularly important that thousands of young men and women who are brought into federal jobs not be subjected to the type of influence in that service of the government. One homosexual can pollute a government office. The committee feared that gay people would be susceptible to blackmail and would be willing to pay large sums of money or give information to avoid being outed. Hoey's committee would suggest media action, accusing government agencies of taking a head-in-the-sand approach. Hoey's committee would also make recommendations to local police forces in Washington, D.C. on how to apprehend homosexual people. Measures included a fine of up to $500 and could include a sentence of 6 months in prison for a public display of affection. The committee also recommended that the act of soliciting immoral sexual acts be made illegal. This would be an attempt to close loopholes and crack down on the gay community of Washington, D.C. President Dwight Eisenhower would later sign an executive order 10450 in 1953, officially placing homosexual people on a list of security risks to be removed from the government. This order would not be fully recanted until 1994, when President Bill Clinton's Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy went into full effect. Although in 1969, the U.S. Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. had already ruled that federal servants could no longer be fired solely on the grounds that they were homosexual. Protections for members of the LGBTQ community working in the federal government would not be put into place until the Obama administration in 2008. Despite the eventual reversal of these policies, the language outlined in the Senate report is especially concerning as it sets a precedent for the LGBT community to suffer for decades of abuse. Harmful stereotypes such as the aforementioned pollution of government offices help solidify a myth of the predatory, sexually obsessed gay man in the guise of a warning. These harmful notions painted homosexuality not only as different and alien to the respectable modern American Christian, but also as a dangerous group in the same way that the threat of communism is. Hoey's report stated that homosexuals could be cured with a proper treatment, leading to decades of electroshock therapy and other seriously harmful methods of conversion. Because communists and homosexuals did not fit into the American conformity of domestic Protestantism, they were to be feared and hated as bastions of anti-Christendom and Satanism when taken from the standpoint of evangelicals like Billy Graham. The close connection between these two groups was heavily influenced by the religious revival of the 1950s, and as a result, it became increasingly dangerous for LGBTQ people to retain government jobs during and after the Red Scare. Until the mid-1990s, much of the information regarding the anti-LGBTQ purges in the Lavender Scare were repressed by the United States government, until historian David K. Johnson was granted access to thousands of pages of recently declassified documents. Johnson's The Lavender Scare was one of the first widely known accounts of this side of McCarthyism, and his research significantly expanded upon what was previously known about the lives of homosexual Americans dismissed from government jobs in the 1950s. Johnson states the following in regards to his findings. These documents show that there is no ad hoc campaign to get rid of a few troublesome gay people. I found page after page with the names of hundreds of people who lost their jobs, transcripts of interrogations, manuals instructing security officers on the best techniques to pressure people into confessing, notes describing confrontations with informants. It was chilling. The United States acknowledged the role the federal government had played in mass discrimination of the LGBTQ community in July of 2011, over 60 years after thousands of government employees were outed in a Justice Department legal brief. The case in question was Galinsky versus the United States of Personnel Management, of which the Department of Justice stated that the federal government had a significant and regrettable role in the history of discrimination against gay and lesbian individuals. It is important to remember that despite the progress of the last 70 years, members of the LGBTQ community still face significant discrimination practices. In 2019, former President Donald Trump instituted a ban on the service of transgender individuals in the military, which was reversed later this year in January. The lasting effects of the discriminatory thoughts and policies of McCarthyism and the moral panics of the 1950s are clearly still prevalent in American society today. Thank you.